in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
Premium becomes nutrition, premium becomes sleep, premium becomes just like non-sleep recovery as well. And if you get any one of those three wrong, you're riding a roller coaster that is really going to be volatile, and you're probably going to start to snap at people.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Coach Aaron Geiser, where we're going to discuss how to set up your racing season. Aaron, welcome back to the show.
It's nice to be here again, and it's good to see your face week to week.
Yeah, no, I know. I always look forward to recording the podcast episodes. They're always a breath of fresh air. And Aaron's actually down in Florida right now, so he's got a better background than I do. If you're not on YouTube, go over to the YouTube channel and just take a look. He's got an oceanside view, and it looks really nice. So he's coaching some athletes who are doing the full Ironman down there. You're not racing, right?
I am not racing.
Yeah,
I get it's my season's over, so it's kind of nice to just kind of operate on the course and not have the same requirements or expectations. It's just telling other people what to do.
Yeah. You're now mitigating the stress that other people are building up before their races, versus being the stressed out individual there.
And I find it awesome from the perspective of the non-racer. Because 2 weeks ago I was out in California. This week I'm out in Florida, and you walk through the village or you're walking through the town, and you got a ton of type A personalities. Anxiety is starting to load up, and you just don't have a care in the world.
Nope.
I'm down here with my wife, my dogs, and we're just walking around with big grins on our face, and you're just seeing somebody waiting for that next problem to arise and have the meltdown of a lifetime.
Yep. Yeah, there is certainly a lot of stress, especially, building up to a full Ironman, especially, right? Because that is like a half day of work, or, if it's a work day, it's a full day of work. And, you put in so much time and effort, and it's just one of those things where it's like, what could go wrong? You're trying to plan and, manage that. And then you're like, well, what if I get a flat tire? What if my nutrition bottles fall off? What if, right? And, that's all just building that anxiety. And then, I was in Kona for the women's Ironman World Championships, and, didn't even have a booth or anything like that. I was just coordinating with people, and it was great. I just walk around exactly like what you're saying, not a care in the world, talk to people at the vendor booths, probably annoy them because I'm asking them so many scientific questions. And then I'm like, oh, well, those were great questions. Okay, I'm going to go on a bike ride now. And if I come back in 2 hours, if I come back in an hour and a half, who cares? It's a beautiful day. I got enough. Hopefully I have enough nutrition and hydration on the bike. That was almost a mistake that I made. But yeah, it certainly is a different mentality. And actually this is a perfect beginning, because I want to talk about, setting up your racing season so you actually get to your race and you're stressed out, but you're excited for the race and you're not dreading actually having to do the act of racing. Because what Aaron and I have found, or at least what I've found in my coaching career, is that I get individuals who are super excited to go and race and do their A race, but it's like 8 months away. So they're all gung-ho. I start, programming for them. It's like, okay, we're going to do a slow build, and then we're going to build up to the race and all of that. But about 6 months into it, maybe 5 months into it, they're like burnt out, because they've already kind of like blown all of that excitement, gotten through that excitement, and now it's like kind of time to grind. And then they're kind of limping, to the start line, which is the opposite of where we want to be. We want to be excited to get to the start line to show our true potential. And yet I think because seasons can be so long, we kind of there's a mental shift that happens, and then we end up being burnt out. So I'd love to get your take on that, and then we can just discuss, how do we set up a racing season? What sort of pitfalls can we avoid, so that we're not getting to the end of the season totally burnt out?
And when you and I first kind of discussed this topic, it stood out like a sore thumb just because it's a common process, and so many athletes get very excited by choosing races throughout the course of the season when maybe they don't recognize whether they love or don't love training, or whether they don't have the time to commit to a big block of training for that long of a period of time. Also, the other thing that I often see, Phil, is an athlete will stack a couple of races over the course of like a 5 month period. And the problem is their best race is that first or second race, because we built them up. We did a progressive build. We got into some specific work. We got into some competitive work. Went into those first one or two races, and they were still kind of fresh with that process.
Mm-hmm.
Often after that second race, it's almost like, okay, well, now we never come back to aerobic base. Even though we're getting a little bit of exposure, we're not coming back to that block, I should say. We never come, like, you might get into trying to find a way based on how much time you have of coming back into a specific phase. But most likely you're handing 1 month off of competitive phase to another month of competitive phase to another month of, so it's like you go 4 months of putting high intense workout out, and it just starts to wear your body down. It wears your mind down, and
Mm-hmm.
it's extremely, like, you and I've talked about multiple times, kind of that 80-20 principle. The importance of that 80 is also from a mental standpoint, other than
Mm-hmm.
just the physical and physiological standpoint. And when you put your body into a poor race scheduled year, you consistently go into that competitive phase. You do progress during the early part of the season, but then you start to actually regress through the rest of the season, because you're spending this big block of time in that what we call the gray zone, and you can't sustain for that long. The body is just, and especially as we age, the body is just not built to sustain that type of stress levels on a regular basis. And
Mm-hmm.
in the real life, especially with age groupers, you have jobs, you have kids, you have these other aspects of life that are pulling you in multiple different directions. And it premium becomes nutrition, premium becomes sleep, premium becomes just like non-sleep recovery as well. And if you get
Mm-hmm.
any one of those three wrong, you're riding a roller coaster that is really going to be volatile, and you're probably going to start to snap at people. And it was funny, Dan and I did a webinar yesterday, and somebody asked something about overtraining, and we don't necessarily like to utilize the word overtraining. We typically go to non-functionally overreaching or functionally
Mm-hmm.
overreaching. And functionally overreaching is a place that we see as being a good point. Like, you're adapting to the training stimulus, you're recovering, but that non-functional overreaching is often when you're not hitting those points. And he made the comment of, if you meet three bastards in a day, it might be your training. So it was one of those things where if you come across like three people in a very short amount of span that irritate you, you probably
Mm-hmm.
are doing, if you're training, you're doing too much training, because you're kind of rolling that roller coaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is, when we get people like, so there's people who are motivated by, kind of like the intrinsic factors. I'm doing this exercise to make myself better, and then I get to show off my prowess on race day. Like that's one mentality you can have. But I think a lot of people, and there's no right or wrong answer here, but there's just differences in ways we get motivated. And then there's other people who are, I need to have a race on the schedule in order to maintain my motivation, because it's that outcome goal that really gets them kind of like jazzed and jacked up and ready to go. And the challenge with that sort of mentality sometimes is that the first race, like exactly like what you were saying, is totally fine because you have, kind of that proper build, that proper, going from less specific to more specific base to a little bit more of that like gray zone training. And then you go, you nail the race, and you're all pumped up. But a half Ironman, an Ironman, anything that's like, longer than probably like 2 hours or so is really, really taxing on the body. So you have to have enough time for that body to then absorb that load. And it's not just from a physical perspective. It's exactly what you're saying. It's a mental perspective too. And if you're not allowing the body to fully recover, it's this law of supercompensation, right? Like when you stress the body, your physiology, everything starts to decline. But when you rest, that's actually when you get those adaptations. And that's when you bounce back and you're stronger than, than where you were before. But if you're always racing, you're decreasing, and then you're recovering a little bit because of, your good coaching management, in terms of volume intensity, but then you race again, and then you're diving deeper into that well, and then you're racing again, and you're always, kind of diving deeper into that well, and eventually you get to a point where, I think in all honesty, the first indications of overtraining are not enjoying what you're doing, loss of sleep quality, being grumpy, right? Like I think your mood changes before your body starts to deteriorate. So those are
Yep.
always kind of like first signs that maybe you need to take a step back. And this is where I think having a good coach is really important, because they can tell you, they can say, "Hey, what's your plan, for racing this year?" And you come to them and you say, "Oh, well, I have 5 races that I want to do." Most good coaches should be like, "Well, let's be a little cautious here. Maybe like how many races?" And I know this is highly dependent on the individual. So let's say like an age grouper, how many races do you think should be like a maximum for people to be able to bounce back and be effective at each of those races?
So what I'm going to do is give a couple of like points to that on top. So one's going to be your age. Two's going to be, what is your job? What, like, do you have
Mm-hmm.
an ebb and flow to your job and the stress that's going to be presented to you in that sense? Um, do you have kids? How many kids? How many events are they involved in? So if you have children that are getting into soccer, cross country, baseball, football, and you have to kind of coordinate a schedule with your partner to get the kids from point A to point B. This is another thing. So it's I if you have a couple of those, like let's say if you check 2 of those boxes, I kind of look at 2, maybe 3 races is the max that I would put on you. If you
Mm-hmm.
don't have some of those boxes checked, then that number can expand out, but it's still what I look at it as. Let's pick a point where we're going to back up 2 races together and then like move one further off of that point. So therefore,
Mm.
we can fully recover after that second race. We can come back and do a little bit of aerobic development again. Then we could potentially, in that case, depending on how long we pull it down, we could skip the specific phase altogether and go back into a competitive phase, or we could do another kind of 12 or 14 week build through the 3 phases and give you that refreshed aspect and outlook for the second half of the season. So Phil, really in that case, I'm asking multiple questions to that athlete, or I already have that information, and these are the questions that I would want the audience to ask themselves: is what are the guaranteed requirements that I have through the course of the season? Let me put those
Mm-hmm.
on paper. Let me look at that when I'm looking at these races, so therefore they can determine the right amount of races that is technically right for them.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important. And I also think like it's important to pick what your most important races are, for the schedule. For example, like maybe if you just want to get the racing itch, like maybe sometimes you just do a Saturday and you just do a sprint triathlon, because like I feel like the ability to recover from a sprint triathlon is a lot better than, or a lot easier than a half Ironman and Ironman. So then you can kind of tickle that itch. Maybe you know, pair that with like a long ride or something like that, like, so you can keep it a little bit more specific. But I think, you know, if that's really kind of like how you're motivated, getting into the competition sort of stuff, go do a sprint. You know, like that shouldn't be a terrible, you know, like stressor on your body, especially if you're already doing a lot of volume. What do you think about this, Aaron? Training through your early season races. So for example, you don't, you know, do like you do aerobic base, and then you just, you know, you just have your first race. And yes, you're not going to be as honed or as sharp or whatever it is, but yeah, what do you think about that? Like, is that something that you would ever utilize, or is that kind of like, eh?
Well, let me start by saying triathletes often, and I would probably say most endurance athletes are a little bit type A personality. Asking them to do something adequately is not in the vocabulary. It's not something that's fully understood. So one,
Right.
understanding who you're having, like who you would might be doing that with, is going to be important. Like if it's somebody that just needs to check a box, okay, maybe. But I still like taking an athlete through at the very least a 3-day taper before, and then at
Mm-hmm.
least a 3 or 4 day recovery in that case. And often what we have found through Endure IQ is that if we take an athlete, or let's say not we, if an athlete goes into a race with no taper, we have found that it takes them longer to recover. So
Mm.
if you're trying to get ready for another race and you don't go into that race fully tapered, you're going and given a plus effort, or even an A effort, because we're not expected to even, again, it's not in the vocabulary to, hey, give me that C effort and you're going to be good. You're going to be a
Right.
happy camper at the end of the day. It's not feasible, and it's not realistic. So tapering for at least 3 days allows kind of that progression and absorption of the fitness that you've put into the body race. And what we recognize is that it just is allows for the athlete to come back and get into some normal training a lot faster post that event. What we see is it's 7 to 10 days in recovery sometimes. One, if they're not fully prepared for that specificity, and then
Mm-hmm.
two, they didn't taper that training load. Technically, yes, one of them was an event, but if you look at that total training load, it might go up 15 to 45%, which is a
Right.
significant dose of stress in that case. And that's why 7 to 10 days, it ends up being maybe even longer for some athletes, depending on some of the other aspects of it. So I don't know if I try not to utilize that as a tool, because it creates too much of an imbalance. And as I said, there maybe would be somebody out there that you might do it for, but it's not a strategy that I use on a regular basis and have used up to this point.
Yeah. No, I think and that's why you're on the show, right? Because you have, you know, that experience and that those insights. Like, you've tried it before. Oh, it didn't work out. You know, we've generally seen 3 days of taper at the very minimum allows to absorb the load of the race. Because yeah, let's be honest, like, for most of us, if we're going out and we're trying to race, we're trying to race. Like, my mom asked me when I was doing my first Ironman, oh, like, are you just going out to enjoy the day and stuff? I was like, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. Like, I didn't say it, you know, directly like that to her, but I was just like, no, mom, I'm going out to win. Like, and I knew I wasn't going to win, but I was like, I'm going out to give my best effort on that day,
Right.
not just to like finish it. Right. You know, like, and I hope a lot of people resonate with that, because that is the mentality, even for races where we're like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna go and like go easy and it'll just be a fun, you know, like, you know, Sunday jog, whatever. It's like, no, no, no. it becomes an ego thing eventually.
100%. And it's, we've all even been on a training run when somebody has maybe passed us and we're like, what the? No, it's not happening.
Yep.
So it's,
Yep.
it's the same thing. And if you go into that race and it's sadly, we all have these thoughts of ourselves, as you said, ego, and you have a couple of people. Well, first person passes you, okay, I can deal with that. Second person, yeah, you start to get a little front. The fourth and fifth, you're like, oh heck no, this ends
Yeah.
now, and then you
Especially
just go back picking people up.
yeah, especially when that person looks like somebody you should be able to beat. And that's like total intrinsic bias. You're like,
Oh heck
you have
yeah.
no idea who this person is or anything like that. But if there's somebody who does not look like they should be beating you, that's like
Oh
a
hell no.
bruiser, right? so
It,
so yeah,
it's
okay. So
it,
that makes
it takes
sense.
a
Let's
great deal of discipline. So it takes a great deal of discipline to
yes.
go and race like that. And one thing that we just have to be, you got to know your weaknesses. And often that is a weakness of many athletes, is that perspective. And when, as you said, you get passed by somebody you don't know, and maybe that individual runs a 5:55 mile per like pace, but they pass you and
Mm-hmm.
you just, oh hell no, and then nobody's going to pass you the rest of
Mm-hmm.
the day, or you're at least going to try that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not, I just don't like that philosophy, because it's very very hard for an athlete to get into that environment or arena and actually pull the reins on themselves multiple times to make sure that they do stick to that plan.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think so far what we've kind of discovered is don't train through a race, because for most people from a mental standpoint, it's not going to be training through a race. It's going to be, you're going to get in there, you're probably going to go a bit too hard, and then that's just going to extend how much recovery you need, especially if you're not tapering, um, especially if you're not tapering beforehand. I wanted
And,
to.
and one
Oh, go
other
ahead.
thing, Phil, I'll say with that is that also you kind of utilize the thought process of getting into that point uh, of aerobic training. So the other thing to that is, if you go in and don't have that specificity built up yet and you go and race that race hard, you're probably going to do some soft tissue damage. Just, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're not talking about anything major, but you're going to do some trauma to the body that will also extend out that recovery period too. So
Yeah.
sorry to cut you off on that one.
No, no, not at all. I think that is a really good point, because it's like there's a lot of people out there who talk about how, oh yeah, you can do an Ironman on five. I don't know if this is actually like what they say, but it's like you can do an Ironman on 5 hours a week of training. You can do like I did an ultra marathon on my max long run was like 15 miles, and it was a 31-mile race. It's like, yes, you can do it, but you're not putting yourself in an optimal physiological state to be able to absorb that that stress and that load, because inevitably when you get to that race, if you're only, say for example, if you were only doing base training with very minimal specific training, you're going to be doing a power outputs or intensities that are much lower than your race intensity. So your body is not going to have the structures built up to actually be able to tolerate that load in that moment. So your fatigue, like your fatigue when you're doing base training, let's say is kind of flat, maybe a little bit. You're not functionally overreaching really. You're just kind of accumulating a little bit of fatigue as you go.
Right.
But then when you actually get to go to the race, because that is not something your body is used to, that fatigue accumulation is almost exponential. And you're really going to run into then issues of potentially injuring yourself. Like hopefully it's not something that would cause a long-term injury, but you're definitely going to create more stress and more fatigue than if you had done a sport specific block before that, functionally overreached, where you're not getting to the point where your stress bucket is overflowing, but it's getting there. and then tapering a little bit, recovering, super compensating, and then going to the race and being able to actually absorb it. Yeah, so that's the next point I want to make is I think a lot of us we need to stop separating the stress of life from the stress of training, because I think there was some sayings is like, oh well, exercise is actually eustress, right? It's good stress, EUSTRESS. It's good stress, right? It makes our bodies build, whereas like work stress, life stress, other things like that is de-stress. It's causing us worse. It's making us worse. I don't think that's the case. I think stress is stress is stress. Your body doesn't differentiate between, oh, this is exercise, oh, this is life stress. You have one bucket, and all of the stress that you have is filling up that bucket. And as soon as that bucket starts to overflow on the top, then that's when you start to run into issues. That's when you are non-functionally overreaching. It's where you start to run the risk of injury, run the risk of burnout, run the risk of getting sick, other things like that. So it's really important to try to manage all of those stressors as you go, or as you're trying to evaluate what's best for me and for the racing season.
And another another piece to the puzzle comes out of why we see things very similarly and get along so well. I have the conversation with my athletes of that bucket and said whether it's
Mm-hmm.
training stress, whether it's life stress, whether it's nutritional stress, whether it's not sleeping stress, all those things fill that bucket. And when that bucket does overload, what happens? Things start pouring out, and it's valuable to look at it from that perspective, because so many people don't, and they compartmentalize different types of stress when the body doesn't give a rat's. It's going to take stress as stress, and there's going to be a breaking point, and you have
Mm-hmm.
to be sensitive to that, because if you push past it, you're no good to anybody, whether it be physically or within just being a person in your community or life. You
Mm-hmm.
have to manage all of those aspects to be a functional adult and functioning human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, um, you know, that's where it really takes a lot of kind of self-reflection to really understand, and a good coach, right? Somebody who you're going to be able to talk to, because like, for example, when I was doing my PhD, you're living in a world where everybody's stress bucket is pretty much full to almost overflowing, and that becomes then the norm in terms of how you stack up. Whereas I think, different people manage stress differently. So some people's stress buckets are super, super big,
Yeah.
while others might be a little bit smaller. And I think stress is a relative thing. So if it's something you've never experienced before, it's exactly okay. This is actually like a perfect training analogy, right? If I went out and I did a half Ironman today, it would be a huge, huge stress, because I'm not training for swimming. I'm doing an hour on the bike every day. I'm only doing, like a run every, twice a week. And it's really just like down the hill and up the hill. Whereas if Aaron did a half Ironman, that stress accumulation from a relative perspective is going to be much lower. So, so you also have to think about stress in terms of like the flux of it. So did you just have a kid? I feel like that is something that takes a lot of time to build up stress tolerance to, right?
Oh, heck yeah.
You're immediately,
You're thrown into a lack of sleep. You have a new human to care
yeah.
for. In that case, you're sharing the load, hopefully with someone else. But in that case, you are somewhat learning a new life, and your
Mm-hmm.
time is much more sensitive. Your time is different than it was before. So heck yeah, I mean that I if you're adding a new pet to the family, like all of these things kind of throw that in there. But it's funny that you say what you said about the Iron Man and the stress between the two of us. It's like some of those Instagram posts that you've put out over the last few months. you ask me to do that, my like two of them, my stress bucket would be pretty close to full in that case. It's not
Hmm.
something that comes naturally, or it's not a skill that I've developed, I guess I should say, because I don't know if it necessarily truly comes natural to a lot of people. But yeah, you're 100% correct in that, where be sensitive to what might set your partner off, or what sets somebody else around you at work, or somebody else, a training partner, off, might not be the exact same things that set you off. You need to be
Hmm.
somewhat sensitive and understanding that here are some of my roadblocks, here are some of the fences that I need to mend to get from point A to point B in that case. And it's part of that process.
Yeah. Yeah. And the whole conversation of stress, right, is sometimes challenging because I think people underestimate how life really does affect them. They, because especially for guys, in a sense, like, you're not supposed to show emotion. You're not supposed to tell people how much that, is stressing you out and other things like that. So I think opening up that conversation and having a good coach who you trust and can kind of confide in is super important, just to get a different perspective on things. And
And
I'm not.
from
Go
the
ahead.
women's standpoint, I mean, I hear quite frequently that when some mothers go out and train, they sometimes are kind of given that outlook of, well, why aren't you home with your kid? So not being like,
Yeah.
sometimes having somebody that you have can have that conversation with to tell you, look, this is your time too. You can, I mean, it's perfectly acceptable. Maybe somebody might look at it differently, but if, I mean, again, this is important to you, get out and do what you need to do, but having that voice. So I think it comes from a lot of different perspectives, but
Yeah.
this all kind of comes into factors of scheduling that right race season, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's looking at things and recognizing what stresses and what stressors you have through the course of the season to pick the right flow to your season. Because just picking 5 races, like blindly throwing a dart at a dartboard of the 5 races that you're going to do, is not a good strategy. And I think
Mm-mm.
it's recognize or remember why you do what you do. And if you're doing this to just race, okay, well, maybe picking a bunch of smaller races and then one gigantic race is a little bit different, because it's a lot easier the early part of the season with those smaller races. It's a lot lower stress load. You can build up to that
Hmm.
big race. But to pick, I mean, some individuals that talk to me about having 3 half Ironmans, 2 full distance Ironmans, and they're all about 5 to 6 weeks apart. To me, that's a suicide mission. It's just not
Yeah.
setting you up. And I really, young or old in that case, it might not be the best long term advice for you or strategy for you from a health standpoint either, because that is really stressing your adrenaline, like your adrenals and everything else. It's just not probably the ideal scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. I 100% agree with that. It again, it comes back to figuring out how much stress you're under, what sort of stress you can handle. And like you were saying, Aaron, it comes from all places. Stress can. So you really have to be aware of that. And then mindfully planning your season so that so that you can kind of ebb and flow with what life throws at you as well, because that's another thing, is like we can plan till we're blue in the face, but then somebody gets sick, something happens with work, maybe a family issue occurs, other things like that. You need processes in place that allow you to then absorb that stress. And a lot of the times what I see, especially for people who are like who do this race plan where it's 5 or 6 weeks apart, for the entire season, they, as opposed to continuing doing their training and other things like that, they try to get through the training, but then they have all this stress from work, and then they get to the race and then they DNF because they just can't handle it once it comes to actually racing, as opposed to just being like, well, if we hadn't scheduled that race or the race after that, and we really only picked 2 or 3 races throughout the season, I would honestly, like, for me, it would probably be like 2 races. But if we picked like 2 races, then you can say, oh, well, life is happening right now. So we're just going to just try to get in as much easy work as you can, because we're not trying to add more stress by doing, race specific work. We're not trying to be in that competition phase where we have to do a lot of like, intervals at race pace and other things like that. We have time to try to absorb it. So yeah, so that's, I think you have to give yourself a little bit of leeway. And us as type A individuals, we have a tendency to overestimate what we can take on, and we don't give ourselves enough grace to be like, to be like, oh, well, let me just back off a little bit, because if I'm consistent throughout the entire year, you're still going to be on an upward trajectory.
Right.
So.
When another factor to that is having the conversation with your partner too, because often they're going to go down this process with you, and that individual might be working themselves. They might have stressors that are coming up during this time, which is again going to affect your training volume and how you absorb intensity at that case. So having those conversations as well is super important, because I mean, especially with my wife, one, she's a payroll manager, so she every 2 weeks is her busy week. So if I'm going to look at her traveling with me, I have to schedule it around that. Two, when I go into a build phase, I'm putting in 20 to 25 hours of volume a week, and there's a good chance that she's going to have to pick up just a little bit more responsibility around me, around the house. She also recognizes that I'm probably going to be a little bit more, I'm going to take some clothes off, throw them in the corner of the room. They might stay there for a couple of days before they get put into the hamper. I'm going to be a little bit more messy and some other things. So we traditionally have those conversations too, to make sure that the household is prepared for what I'm going to endure and what I'm going to put myself through. And if she's not on board with that, then it's like, okay, well, maybe I need to look at a different phase, or look at it something timing wise that's going to change that to allow for everybody to be pulling that rope in the same direction. Because we traditionally, especially if you're looking at an Ironman, I still think you should probably be picking up a secondary job in that case. And from a training standpoint, it's your secondary part-time job.
Yeah.
And it doesn't pay very well, and it typically costs more than it actually you pull in. But it's a scenario where you are going to need to utilize, or you should utilize, the support system that you have around you, and it's going to make life and training and all these areas that we've kind of gone over a lot easier than if you try to go through this alone, or have the household stay at that same level. It's going to place a lot more stress on you and the rest of the household to try to maintain that output. And it's just not realistic. It's not sustainable too. And if, again, you choose 4 or 5 races, the household is not going to be able to sustain that structure for very long before it starts to fracture.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think having those conversations with your partner is extremely important, because if you have these goals of being successful in an Ironman, your partner has to, exactly what you were saying, understand that sometimes those roles and everything are going to have to shift a little bit to, like, during different phases of the season. And it's a two-way street, right? If you're swimming upstream all the time, that gets pretty damn tiring. as opposed to, if both of you are swimming downstream together and, picking up the slack, drafting off each other, not to make it, make
Yeah.
your family a training, sort of metaphor, but it makes things a whole heck of a lot easier, as opposed to, I've heard some people, their spouses get a little, like, have some animosity towards people training, and they're just like, oh, you're just always on that bike, you're never helping with stuff. It's like I'm doing this because it's something that is really important to me. And if you supported me in that, then it would lessen my stress bucket, open me up to actually help more, with outside of training. But if you're always getting attacked, for doing what you're doing, then there's some level of animosity both ways that start to build up. And then
Yep.
that's not healthy for a relationship, and not having a healthy relationship, can lead to, things with sleep, can lead to stress in the relationship, making that bucket fill up faster. And it's just, it can just be a challenge. So, it's like, I just want to tell everybody, I'm not a, like psychologist or anything like that. So take what you will from my, my family and spousal advice. But those are just things that I've seen in the past that I think, can ease things a little bit, because it is stressful, right? Doing training is, especially with these longer things, a full-time job, just like you were saying, Aaron. Or not a full-time job, it's a half-time job, and then you're working a full-time job, and then you're, also having to do everything else on top of that. So it's tough. So you need to lower all of the other stressors, in your life, as much as possible, but still staying, productive in terms of, like pulling your weight, essentially.
And it's a super valuable point. And again, it's maybe just having a conversation. And that,
Mm-hmm.
so when do you want me to have these workouts done by? Or how can I set this up to allow for us to check the boxes together, or for me to check the boxes that you expect me to check? So it often it's just having the conversation and
Mm-hmm.
saying, how can I help maintain some stability here or assistance while still being able to check this goal that I have
Mm-hmm.
off along that process? And it's just have the conversation.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what a household would look like if both people, were training for an Ironman at the same time. And like, maybe it would work really well, because you're just so focused, you just both do your training together, everything is kind of done together. But that seems like it could be pretty challenging, right? From maintaining the household, point of view.
Oh, and I have some of these individuals in my life, and for anybody out there that maybe has exposure to a household that does, I would say sit down and have a conversation with those individuals, because I think that they have some cheat codes to life that could really help
Mm,
you. Because the individuals that I have in my life, I luckily had exposure to it early in my triathlon career, and having conversations with them, they had been doing it already for like 15 or 20 years. They they have the cheat codes written, and it works for them. Tell me your secret, kind of like share
mhm.
with me what you can do. Sometimes those conversations, it's worth taking them out to dinner and just hearing what they have to say and how it kind of connects together. And it can really kind of put you on that fast track to making the process that much more like doable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always good to get advice from, or like, find a coach, find a mentor who's been doing things a lot longer than you have. That's kind of like, I look up to Aaron from that perspective, because I want to continue to get better as a coach, and now I'm spoiled because I get to talk to him pretty much every single week about this sort of stuff. So I learn a lot, from you, Aaron. It's super helpful, and I'm glad we get to share it with people, because this type of wisdom is something that you could probably learn just from trial and error, but I think you can really accelerate your ability to, like to do anything, right? If you have a mentor who can say, that's a common misconception that I've run into before, but instead of doing that here, this is what I do instead. Um, exactly like,
You're
we go ahead.
you're exactly correct, and I have conversations with athletes on the daily, and early in my coaching career, individuals would ask me, "How long have you been coaching triathlon?" Like, I've been doing coaching for a large portion of my life, but coaching
Mhm.
triathlon at that time was a fairly short window. And they're like, "Well, how the heck did you get here?" Well, one, I connected with smart people. Two, they helped me kind of they helped me get over some of those early hurdles that maybe I could have taken 15 years to go through and learn on my own. They have been through a lot of those things, and I asked them questions and got details on how to overcome some of those challenges, because there's a lot of people, especially in this sport, that have lived through all of those challenges. If you get the exposure to that person, sit down and have a conversation with them, because you're going to walk away with some
Mhm.
great knowledge that that person maybe took 15 or 20 years to evolve to. You're going to be able to do it
Right.
over, a couple of conversations. So it really is important to have that exposure and take other people's scenarios and involve them into your coaching process, because it's gonna end up coming back and showing its head to somebody in some form. And then just say, you know what, I had that conversation with somebody else. Let's try this approach, or let's go with
Mhm.
this result rather than that, because we knew that one wasn't a very it didn't have a very high success rate.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the cool things about this day and age is the fact that you have so much information available to you all the time. And a lot, I mean, and with podcasts especially, you have long form conversations that you can listen to people, and then like you know where to find Aaron and I, on social media and stuff. So you can try to have that. You can have a conversation in the DMs. It's a little bit harder, right? To just like ask detailed conversations and stuff. But that's like, at least for me, that's why I always offer to like, hey, reach out to me if you have any questions. Like if it's something that we really need to dig into, like let's have a conversation on Zoom or something like that, because that conversation is probably going to be more valuable to you than just kind of blindly wandering through the world, bumping into trees and everything. And I think some old school people would be like, well, you got to do that in order to really learn. But I've always thought, stand on the shoulders of giants, replicate and kind of duplicate what really resonates with you, and then learn from what doesn't really resonate with you. Maybe it's something
Right.
you're like, well, I don't really agree with that. So then use your problem solving brain and say, okay, how would I actually approach that if it was, for my scenario? And that's more of a, just like life skill in general is the more questions you can ask people, and the more questions you can, or the more thoughtful you can be about asking those questions, people love to share. People love to talk about themselves. That's something my dad always told me. Like, so he would go to his work stuff, and he'd just be like asking questions about people. And they're like, oh, Ted Batterson, he's like the nicest guy I've ever met. It's like, yeah, because he just asks questions and he's interested in you. So generally people, if you ask them a favor and you say, hey, like I really admire like what you're doing. Here's my question about, like I've been struggling with this. Here's my question. Most of the time, people aren't going to be mean about it. They're going to be like, oh yeah, like I got some time. Like, let's talk.
It's all about phrasing, right? If you phrase it the right way, somebody's always
Hmm.
going to be like, "Oh yeah, I'll tell you that. What do you need to hear?"
Yeah. Hmm. Yep. People really like to share. So let's do a little bit of a summary here. I
Mhm.
think one of the biggest things that we need to do is stop over racing. Because over racing, as you said, leads to this cycle of kind of spinning your wheels, and it's not a good spinning your wheels. You're spinning your wheels in the sense of you're in this trap of continually racing, stressing yourself up, not recovering enough, racing, stressing yourself out, not recovering enough. And then by the end of the season, you wind up, burnt out. And, it's unfortunate because then, one of the solutions to that is like, oh, I don't want to do any more triathlon training. I don't want to do any more of that. And, that could end a career, or
Mm-hmm.
it could be an extended hiatus from that because you are so burnt out that you don't want to do it. So
Or
manage,
I've
I think
also
it,
seen it.
oh, go ahead.
I've also seen it, Phil, where that's then parlayed into more events too. So
Mm,
you didn't hit that goal that you had set for that. So then instead of calling it a season, taking the time off that you do need to revitalize and get the passion back in. I have had multiple individuals that try to go back into another race in 4 or 5 weeks, which again just replicates the same thing that put you into that scenario in the first place. So,
mhm.
sorry, I had to throw that in there.
No. What's the definition of insanity? Doing something over and over and over again, expecting the same or expecting a different outcome, even though you're doing it the same way. So, if this is a trap that you fall into, maybe it's time to take a step back, race a little bit less, perhaps invest in a good coach, mentor, those sort of things to then keep you a little bit more accountable. Um, and this kind of just goes, along with our last conversation of, like uh what to do in the off season, how to rest, plan your season accordingly, to who you are and how, you're going to approach it. And I think we'll leave you guys with that one. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments down below if you're on YouTube. You can even comment if you're on Spotify, so you can leave a comment on Spotify. But the easiest way to get in touch with Aaron and I is on Instagram. I'm at Critical02. Aaron's at Try a Geiser, so reach out to us there. And if you guys do have any questions or do just want to reach out to us for conversations, let us know, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.